We're looking tonight at Journeying with Jesus, and there's going to be some Sabbath controversy going on. So we want to get into that directly in John chapter 5. John chapter 5. So if you recall, Jesus has been in the Galilee region. And what was the last thing that we saw that Jesus had done? What was the thrust of what we looked at last week? He selected what? One of his disciples, which is Matthew. So now, after that interrogation that had gone on with the Pharisees, now he is down in Jerusalem with his disciples. All right? So let's have a look at John chapter 5, and I want to read verses 1 to 15. It's a lengthy passage, but we'll start there, and Craig, please.
After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed columns. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there, he knew that he had already been there a long time, and he said, "Do you want to be healed?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred, and while I am going, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, take up your bed, and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now that day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath, and it's not lawful for you to take up your bed." But he answered them, "The man who healed me, that man said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is the man who said this? Who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, as there was a crowd in the place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said, "See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it had been Jesus who healed him.
What you see on the screen, do you recognize that? What's that a logo of or for?
The American Medical Association.
The American Medical Association. It's also the logo for another World Health Organization. Yeah, so it's not only those two. There's others. Specifically with that particular logo, there's other medical associations that we use. Let's go to the next slide. Do you recognize this?
Not particularly.
Not particularly. That would be on some ambulances, many ambulances, particularly in the United States. It's called the Star of Life. So we've got one, which is the single snake, the rod of Asclepius. Anybody ever heard of that? No. What about caduceus? No. Okay. So the one on the right with the 2 snakes is probably one that you would recognize with more medical stuff. The one that is associated with healing, particularly, is the one on the left, which is the rod of Asclepius. Now, we had one, I think, Deb, you mentioned you recognize that. You've heard of the rod of Asclepius. Okay, do you know what the rod of Asclepius is? Do you know what Asclepius is?
I assume it's a person.
He's a person. So he's a Greek god, yeah. So he preceded Rome. The Greek Empire came into power after Persia under Alexander the Great. And they had a whole host of gods, the Greek gods. And you can think of like Zeus and Apollo and the likes of those, the Olympians. We think of Olympians as those that compete in the Olympic Games. Well, the Olympic Games come down from the idea of the gods who were Olympians themselves. So Asclepius was the son of Apollo, one of the 12 Olympians, 12 gods. So he was a god, or a demigod, because we won't get into the parentage and so on. Apollo had relations with a human woman, and so anyway, allegedly. So Asclepius, he was given the power of healing. He was taught healing. The caduceus is the staff or the rod of Hermes, Hermes. So Hermes was a Greek god. The Romans would refer to him as Mercury. And he was the messenger god. He was the god who was the patron of
Mail service.
Pardon me? Mail service, yeah. Commerce. And so it was professionalism that the staff on the right represented more so. And as a result of the rod of the one on the left, which is more medically connected, the one on the right deals with commerce and professionalism. And back at the turn of the 19th, 20th century, there were some who had seen the rod of the caduceus, the one on the right with the wings, and thought it had to do with medical stuff. And it ended up, because of misinterpretation, became a logo for many medical instead of the one on the left with the single. So the root or the background of the symbol for what we see in the medical community today is the rod of Asclepius, because he was identified with healing power. It was believed that Asclepius had the power to raise the dead. Now, there were many who practiced the medical arts, if you will, under Asclepius, and there were upwards of, throughout the Roman Empire. So the Rome overtook Greece, but they adopted many of their beliefs, many of their gods, changed some of their names, but they continued and advanced even more so, and they ended up with some 400 Asclepians throughout the Roman Empire. So Asclepion is a place of healing. It was the predecessor of a hospital. Now, what do you suppose they had at these Asclepions? Just take a guess from the picture.
Snakes.
They had snakes. And snakes would be used as part of the healing process. Now, the snakes there were non-poisonous. They were called Asclepian snakes. People who were looking to be healed, they would come to an Asclepion. One of the main Asclepions, one of the most prominent Asclepions in the Roman Empire, was in Pergamum. And there were priests of Asclepius. There were those who practiced the healing arts in these places. They would have them sleep in certain areas to see if there would be a visitation, and through their sleep and their maybe of a night vision, perhaps a snake would appear to them and indicate there would be a healing that would happen. Maybe Asclepius himself would appear. And then...
I hope the World Health Organization has advanced.
I hope so too. I hope so too. But all of that to say this. They were all throughout the Roman Empire. Now let's go to our next. Jesus comes to Jerusalem, and by the sheep gate. We saw last week where the sheep gate was, and I think that's the next slide. So the sheep gate is on that top right-hand portion, and within that line of A, B, C, E, and then over is the Temple Mount. It's just not pictured there. The sheep gate is where Jesus came, and by the sheep gate was a pool which in the Hebrew is called Bethesda. It had 5 porches. Let's come to the next picture. All right, so there's the pool of Bethesda, remember, in relation to the temple that we saw last week. There, notice the way, now this is an artist's depiction of what it may have had looked like in Jesus' day. At the very least, we know its location is there. The ruins have been uncovered, so you could go to Jerusalem today, just north of the Temple Mount, and can see some of these ruins. But it doesn't indicate specifically that this is what it looked like. This is a rendition, of course. Now notice, there's an upper pool and there's a lower pool. There's 2 levels. That's important to recognize. I'll mention that in just a moment.
I'm surprised that the Jewish people frequent.
Interesting that that is an observation. There were many aspects in the city of Jerusalem that were very Greek in nature. You have a Greek influence and you have Roman influence. Why? Because you have all kinds of Romans that live in Jerusalem. Remember, under whose control is the city of Jerusalem? Rome. And have you heard of the term the Hellenists in the scriptures, particularly in the book of Acts? Acts chapter 6 speaks about there was a dispute that rose between the Hebrew Jews and the Hellenistic Jews. What are the Hellenistic Jews? Yeah, what does that mean, Greek background?
Well, I'm assuming it would the area of Greece and that old, I guess, Greek world way of thinking.
Okay.
I would think that's where my mind would go.
So I'll back up just a little bit to give you an idea. A Hellenist is a Greek. So Greeks were called Hellenists because it was believed that their ancestor, their founder, was Hellene. So Hellene, a great king. The Greeks then were referred to as Hellenists. And there was a lot of influence from the Greeks that was taken over and adapted by the Romans. So you have this Greek art and economy and philosophy and so on that permeates throughout the entire empire of Greece, and then it continued through the Roman Empire. And even to the point that there were many Jews that they would try to reverse their circumcision. In other words, they would go through surgical procedures to make it appear as though they'd not been circumcised, because when there was competing in the games, the Olympics, they did so without any clothing. And so it would become immediately obvious, if you were a Jew, that you were a Jew. So they would. So it didn't mean that the Hellenists adopted all of Greece or Greco ideas and philosophies, but they would speak Greek as their mother tongue, and they would lean more towards. They'd be more sympathetic to the empire than the Hebrew Jews. The Hebrew Jews would have been more staunch, more legalistic. I guess they'd be Judaizers in a sense. So they'd be more legalistic. So there was a massive influence of the philosophy. You see what happens to the church? The longer the church is in a pagan society, what tends to happen to that culture, as the culture of the church, as the culture of the world spreads far and wide. It tends to have an impact on the church over some generations. So, in answer to your question, why it's surprising that Jews would go to this place if it wasn't Asclepion, it's because these people were desperate. And there's so much other influence and permeance of the Roman culture and the Greek culture that the Romans had adopted, permeated throughout all of the empire, and not least of which was Jerusalem. It was impacted. It had a hippodrome where they had chariot races. They had theaters, which was a pagan idea, and so on. So there was a huge Roman influence, and so many bowed to that or accepted it.
Asclepius, or Asclepius, whatever that guy's name, is there a Roman
Equivalent? Not that I saw. Asclepius was Asclepius. He just carried over into the Roman influence, the Roman Empire. Hippocrates, have you heard his name? The father of modern medicine, he's referred to as, and the Hippocratic Oath you hear that doctors take when they enter into the practice. The original Hippocratic Oath pledged allegiance to Asclepius and his daughters, these gods and goddesses. All right, so we've got Jesus. He's come to this man who's at the pool. Now, one more picture that I want to bring up. If you just go back down, just to the pool, the two pools, where we see the picture of the pool. Yeah, let's do that one right there. That's good. All right. So you notice that there's a upper pool and a lower pool. Now, when it says that in some translations it says an angel of the Lord would at certain times come down and stir up the water, and whoever stepped in first, they would be healed. Now, of course, that's a superstition. So a certain man was there who had a disease, an infirmity, 38 years. That's a long time to have an infirmity. Jesus comes to this man. In verse 6, when he sees him lying there and knew that he had already been in that condition a long time, he said to him, what did he ask him? It's an interesting question for a man who's at a place that is known to be a place of healing, and he's there with all kinds of others. Why did Jesus ask him, do you want to be made well? It's a good question. Did he have to believe? The sick man answered, he says, I don't have anybody to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. When I'm making my way, somebody else is already in long before I get there. And Jesus says, stand up, take up your bed and walk. So this man doesn't even know who Jesus is yet. Because we see that when he's walking, so he took up his mat, his bed, and the Jews, when it says the Jews in the book of John, it's usually meaning the Jewish leaders. It says, not lawful you to carry your bed on the Sabbath. And he answered him and he said, well, a man told me to take up your bed and walk, so that's what I did. They said, who is it? And he said, I don't know. Verse 13, I don't know who it was. Because Jesus had withdrawn and he hadn't made himself known. So he doesn't even know that Jesus, he hasn't heard anything about Jesus. If he has, he hasn't connected it to the man who's standing in front of him. He doesn't know that this is the one who claims to be the Messiah.
He would know that Jesus was alive.
No more than if you were there standing in front of him, he would know that you're alive. He had no idea who this man was. So the man who's sick had no idea that this man was any different from anyone else that's in that area. So a man of renown, a man of a reputation of healing, he knows none of that. Didn't know anything about it. He just knows that this is a guy, says, do you want to be made well? He tells him to get up and walk, and so something obviously takes place in his body so that he has some kind of an awareness. I might be able to try something here. The stirring of the waters. The upper pool and the lower pool. There were pipes. So this is a spring-fed pool. There were pipes that led, that was between the upper and the lower. And what the priests would do, the priests of the Asclepion would do, is that they would open those chambers of the pipes to fill the lower pool when it needed to be filled. And what do you suppose happened with that transition of water? The water stirs. Bubbles up. An angel is stirring the waters. And then they all scramble to get the first one in there. Interesting how superstition just turns into a reality, and the superstition has nothing to do with the supernatural. It has everything to do with something they don't understand or realize is taking place.
It's sort of like a devotion now in our global pandemic.
Okay?
Who Jesus said, "Oh, that's it." Everybody says, "Oh yeah, that's good idea."
So that was in the matter of ideas today, right? But it's not in the matter of superstition. But it could end up developing into something like that. We don't know what the...
Power.
Yeah, true enough. So here we have Jesus. Jesus seeks this man out, and he seeks this man out at this place, at this location. I mentioned last week. Why did Jesus come to this location to heal this man? Why didn't he wait until the man was being moved or brought to there or taken away from there earlier that morning, later that day, or tomorrow, or the day before? Why does he do this on the Sabbath? Why does he do it here instead of as the man is approaching before he even gets to this pool? And I believe that he's there to show himself that he is the one who has the power to raise people to life, not Asclepius. This is a battle of the gods, if you will. See, Asclepius, he was a myth. He was a Greco god, a Grecian god, adopted by the Romans, but only by myth. He didn't truly exist. And Jesus, here he is in the flesh, and he's telling them, listen, if you want to trust in somebody who has power over sickness, power over death, somebody that can raise people to their feet that are lame, trust in me. So this is what he does. This is why he comes to this location. And others would become aware of it. He doesn't hang out at the Asclepian. He comes directly there and then he leaves.
It's a wonder that he did identify Jesus as Asclepius.
Interesting.
Because Asclepius is supposedly a Greek god, and he comes and heals a guy who's been going through this Asclepion.
Yeah. So what's he to think, right? But Jesus doesn't leave him to his own devices. Jesus comes back to him. It's an important thing to recognize and to be aware of. So Jesus tells him to get up and take up your bed and walk. This is something the man can't do in his own strength. But Jesus speaks it. And because Jesus speaks it, he empowers the man by his own word to rise up, carry his mat, and to walk. So immediately the man was made well. So it gives indication he was made well. He's aware of it. So what does he do? He knows there's something going on. And so he gets up, rolls up his mat, and he starts walking home. And interesting that he doesn't draw a whole lot of commotion. It's just like, okay, I'm healed. And he's heading home. So in verse 9, John tells us, and that day was the Sabbath. So John didn't need to let us know that it was the Sabbath, right? But he tells us it was the Sabbath intentionally. Because the Jews take issue with this man because he's carrying his mat on the Sabbath. What's the issue with that? It was work. What kind of work? All right, the law forbade to carry anything. Unless it was in your private dwelling, you couldn't carry anything. So once you left your house, you can't carry any burden, any load, including a mat or whatever the case might be. You can't carry a load in the public domain. Pardon me?
You
The oral law. Thank you. So that was, we looked at it and was referred to last week as the Mishnah. The oral law, which came to be known as the Mishnah, and then writings continued regarding that, and a companion of that is the Talmud. The oral law. The traditions of the elders, the traditions of the Jews. They weren't even allowed to walk more than a Sabbath day's journey, which was about 2,000 cubits, which was approximately a kilometer. So we even have in Acts chapter 1, when Jesus ascended, it says the disciples returned from the Mount of Olives to Jerusalem, which is about a Sabbath day's journey. So it's 2,000 cubits. Any idea why the Pharisees came up with this distance as the distance you could walk and no more on a Sabbath? It's because in the book of Joshua, the Lord told Joshua that he was to take the priests who carry the ark and to go ahead of the encampment of the Israelites to cross the Jordan River. And there's to be a distance between the priests who are carrying the Ark of the Covenant and the lead people of that advancement. And that distance was 2,000 cubits. And so the Pharisees decided, well, I mean, if that's the distance you got to keep from the presence of God, that sounds like a good distance that is the maximum that you could travel on the Sabbath. All kinds of things that they came up with that you can't do on the Sabbath. There's at least 40 things that are listed that you can't do on the Sabbath, and we'll see a few of those in just a minute. So they're upset. The Pharisees are upset. They ask him, "Who told you this?" The man didn't know, because Jesus had withdrawn. And then in verse 14, Jesus finds him. Jesus doesn't just leave us to our own devices. He doesn't leave us without knowledge and awareness of what he's done. He finds him, and what does he tell him in verse 14? Yeah, stop sinning, lest a worse thing come upon you. What is that in the context of? Don't trust in other gods. Don't trust in yourself. Don't trust in man. Don't go back to a place like the Asclepion. You don't need it. The man departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. Well, now things get all excited, because now the Jews are aware of something that Jesus has done. They can peg it on him. So let's look at verse 16 of John chapter 5. 16 to 18. Carolyn, please.
So because Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, the Jews persecuted him. Jesus said to them, "My Father is always at his work to this very day, and I, too, am working." For this reason the Jews tried all the harder to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal to God. Jesus gave them this answer: "I tell you the truth, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can do only what he sees his Father doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son also does."
All right, that's good there. Thank you. So the Jews persecuted Jesus, and they wanted to kill him because he healed on the Sabbath. That's pretty intense. How long have the Jews been acquainted with Jesus? Not a very long time, but we know that the Jews, the Pharisees, have been coming from all Judea, throughout the Galilee, and they've been coming to see who this man was, because the reports of his healings were going through all of the region. And now they discover that he has healed this man in Jerusalem, no less, on the Sabbath day. How dare he? I mean, there was reports of him healing on the Sabbath back in the Galilee. But now they have it caught red-handed. He's just done it. The Sabbath is not over. And now, and that's enough to kill. That's worth killing over. Because somebody healed on the Sabbath. Why? Because for them, the tradition of the elders says you cannot practice medicine, you cannot practice healing on the Sabbath day unless life is at risk. So if a life is not at risk, if somebody breaks their leg, you cannot set a bone on the Sabbath day, for instance. They are at the pool looking for a healing from Asclepius, but remember, they've gone to what was a pagan shrine. But Jesus, because he's operating as a rabbi and claiming to be the Son of God. But he's not yet, as far as they're concerned, really looked at that aspect, but claiming to be, there's claims are, could this be the Messiah? And so yeah, you're right. And then Jesus makes it very clear that he is doing what his Father is speaking to him. My Father is at work until now, and I have been working alongside of him. Notice he calls God my Father. In verse 18, because he does this, then the Jews sought all the more to kill him. So they wanted to kill him because he healed on the Sabbath. Now because he says, my Father, and they know he's referring to God, they wanted all the more to kill him. Why? Because he said that. You're not allowed to say, my Father? It was okay to refer to God as our Father, because he's the Father of all the Jews. Father of the faith, if you will, the author of faith. But to call God my Father is speaking about a special and a unique relationship with God that man doesn't have or can't have. At least as far as they were concerned. And so they wanted to kill him, not only because he broke the Sabbath, but also that he said that God was his Father, making himself what? Equal with God. So when we doubt whether or not Jesus was claiming divinity, the Pharisees are right there, the Jews are right there to clear up all confusion and say that's exactly what he just claimed. And because of this, we want him dead. Because as far as they're concerned, if you have healed on the Sabbath, you have broken the law, and Messiah will not break the law. But what law was the Messiah breaking in their mind? It was the oral law. The law that was made up from their own imaginations. So Jesus continues on and he speaks about these aspects of the fact that, look at verse 20. The Father loves the Son and shows him all things that he himself does, and he will show him greater works than these, that you may marvel. For as the Father raises the dead and gives life to them, even so the Son gives life to whom he will. Remember what was the claims of Asclepius? That he could even raise the dead. What is Jesus saying now? He said, Asclepius can't raise the dead. Even the Jews knew that. They knew that that was mythology. They knew that that was a false god. But here Jesus is saying, the Father has the power to raise the dead. So too do I have the power to raise the dead. So speaking about an equal power. The Father judges no one, but has committed all judgment to his Son. So the judgment of all men belongs to God himself. Psalm chapter 9 even speaks of that. The judgment belongs to God. But if that judgment, as Jesus is saying, is being reserved and being committed to the Son, what does that make Jesus to be? Equal with God. So equal with God, able to raise the dead, who's been given authority to judge. And look at verse 24. Not only can he raise the dead and is he going to judge all men, but in verse 24, we're at Johnny. Can you read that, Johnny?
I tell you the whatever hearts, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life, and I will not be condemned. He has crossed over from death to life.
All right, so you'll have eternal life. You'll not be condemned. The one who trusts in Jesus. So he's equal with God. He has the power to raise the dead. He has the authority to judge. And not only that, but he gives eternal life to all those who will believe upon him. And he's going to raise the dead. Those who believe in him to everlasting life. Those who do not believe in him to everlasting judgment or condemnation in verse 29. Then he speaks about the witness that is there about him. Because the scriptures that they had, the Old Testament. Remember, Jesus is always going back to the written, to the Word. The Pharisees are always going to the oral tradition. So Jesus is bringing their minds to the fact that everything is to be settled in the mouths of how many witnesses? 2 or 3 witnesses. Not just to be established on the testimony of one person, but on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Deuteronomy chapter 17 and verse 6 speaks about that. Deuteronomy chapter 19 and verse 5 speaks about that. Remember, this is a controversy about the Sabbath. The issue isn't that this man was healed. The issue that he was healed on the Sabbath, and then the issue became compounded because Jesus claimed to be God on top of that. And where does the Sabbath connection with the Jews get established? From the Exodus. The Lord said that you will be distinguished as my people through your observance of the Sabbath. We'll look at those verses in just a minute. Deuteronomy 17 and verse 6, Deuteronomy 19 and verse 15, speaking about this idea that you're not to convict anyone on the testimony of one person. Whatever you receive has to be on the testimony confirmed from 2 at the least and up to 3, 2 or 3 witnesses. So not just taking one person's word against another. So Jesus says, all right, don't believe just my own testimony. Verse 31. If I bear witness of myself, my witness is not true. In other words, if I'm the only one that can verify the things that I have done and the claims I've made, if I'm the only source, then don't believe it. Because if I'm the only one and it can't be validated from any other witnesses, any other sources, then obviously it can't be valid. But there's another. So he appeals to John. Look at verse 33. So John, he has borne witness to the truth. This is John the Baptizer. So he's not receiving testimony from man, but I say these things so that you may be saved. In other words, John's already testified about me. So that's one aspect that he gives regarding the witness. Then look at verse 36. There's a greater witness than just John's words. What does he say is another witness? The work that he does. So the miracles that he's performed. Even the people have said, Nicodemus says, we know that you could not perform these things unless you were of God. So they already know that no mere human on their own can conjure up this type of power or can control it or secure it.
Sorry. Now Nicodemus, I'm going back. So Nicodemus, was he from the old law, or was he there and testifying?
He was of the old law. He was the teacher of Israel. He was a rabbi who taught rabbis, and he came to Jesus to find out about his claims and trying to understand him. And we discover that he ends up becoming a disciple of Jesus. Nicodemus does, but not in chapter 3, at least not a record of him being a follower of Jesus. So we have, no problem. Then we have John giving his testimony, the miracles. Then he says in verse 37 and 38, I also have the Father himself, the one who sent me. He's testified of me. You've neither heard his voice at any time nor seen his form, but you do not have his word abiding in you, because whom he sent, him you do not believe. So where is it that the Father bore witness that Jesus is who he says he is? At his baptism. At what point? What happened at his baptism? So the Spirit descended, and a voice came from heaven declaring, this is my beloved Son, whom I'm well pleased. So Jesus has appealed to 3 witnesses. He's going to appeal to one more. Deb, can you read 39 to... let's go down to 44. 39 to 44. Please.
You diligently study the Scriptures because you think by them you possess eternal life. These are the Scriptures that testify about me, yet you refuse to come to me to have life. I do not accept praise from men, but I know you, that you do not have the love of God in your hearts. I have come in my Father's name, and you do not accept me. But if someone else comes in his own name, you will accept him. How can you believe if you accept praise from one another, yet make no effort to obtain the praise that comes from the only God?
All right. Verse 39, specifically. You've been searching the Scriptures. You think you have eternal life through them. And these are they which testify of me. So he said, if you truly believe that the Scriptures bring eternal life, then you would accept me, because the Scriptures testify of me. The Scriptures speak of me. So that's the 4th witness that he appeals to. But he says to them, you can't accept. You can't accept and receive me because they didn't love the Scriptures. Verse 40 to 44 really bears that out. They look for honor from one another instead of looking to glorify God and to receive his approval. So they'll pat each other on the back at how well they're doing with the observance of their laws, but the laws that they observe are specifically the oral laws, the Mishnah, the oral laws, the traditions. So he says, don't think I'm going to accuse you to the Father. In other words, I don't need to be the one who accuses you. Verse 45. There's one who accuses you. It's Moses. Moses accuses you. Now, Jesus is speaking to the Jews, the Jewish leaders. These are the ones that everybody would say, would they observe Moses' teachings? I mean, they're Pharisees. I mean, they are the ones that observe the law of Moses. But they compromised the law of Moses. They didn't understand Scripture. They failed to understand Jesus. They didn't have the love of God in them that we've just seen here in this passage. So the law of Moses ends up condemning them because they failed to believe Moses. They believed Moses. They would say, yes, we believe Moses. But they only believed Moses as was interpreted through the Mishnah. According to the oral law, yes, we believe Moses. And we have reinvented Moses. They wouldn't say we've reinvented him, but that's what they've done. They had reinvented Moses. They didn't believe Moses as it is written. They believed Moses according to their traditions. So, verse 47, if you do not believe his writings, then how will you believe my words? They didn't believe the Scriptures. Their authority was the oral tradition.
Jesus is standing in a hornet's nest, and you can really see his heart in verse 32.
He says these things. He says, I say these things so that you may be saved. He doesn't say it because he wants to run them into the ground. But he's fed up with the oral tradition because Jesus is the Word made flesh. It's His Word that they are distorting and perverting for their own profit and gain. Because they, as Jesus says, you love glory, honor from men rather than from God. All right, so this is his run-in with them over a Sabbath controversy. And Jesus really, He's the one who chooses the turf upon which this showdown takes place. It's within the what's the word I'm looking for? The context of the Asclepion. This false god who the people believe has powers to heal. Jesus saying, don't trust in this. Trust in me. He did it on. He could have done it on the sixth day. He could have done it on the first day, but he did it on the Sabbath day for a very specific reason, so that he would challenge the Pharisees, and he's going to do so again in these next two passages. Luke chapter 6. So Jesus goes now back to Galilee. So Luke 6, verses 1 and 2. Deb, could you read those, please? We had you just one verse, so I'm going to get you to do just a couple more if you wouldn't mind. Oh, I'm sorry, you did so.
Sabbath, Jesus was going through the green fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. Some of the Pharisees asked, "Why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?"
So the parallel passage of this is Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 to 8. Mark chapter 2, 23 to 28. All right, so what was it that was unlawful for them on the Sabbath by them plucking heads of grain to eat? How? Prepare food. Okay, in what capacity? Okay. Think in the way that the Pharisees would be looking at it. They're harvesting. Yeah. So they have harvested, and look what it says. They plucked, harvested heads of grain, and then they what? How did they eat them? By rubbing in their hands. What's rubbing the grain in their hands doing? What? Threshing. What is forbidden by the oral law on the Sabbath? You can't reap. You can't thresh. So just doing this with a few kernels in their hands, threshing. And then what do they have in their hands once they've rubbed the grain in their hands? And are they just going to eat that? Why did they rub it? Why didn't they just put it all in their mouth? They get rid of the chaff. So what do they do to get rid of the chaff? So what have they just done now? They've winnowed. COVID! They have winnowed, because winnowing is separating the chaff from the wheat. And then they ate it, and in so doing, they stored it in their bodies. But according from a Pharisaic point of view, they stored it. So they broke 4 sabbatical laws, Sabbath laws. In their mind. Think of how extreme it was. The rabbis even said of that day, don't walk on the grass on the Sabbath. Walk on a trodden path. Because by walking on the grass, there may be a lone blade of wheat that was there. In so doing, you may separate the grain from the stalk. And then if you perhaps twisted your foot in the process, you may have threshed it. And then the wind or your robe having passed by may cause a little bit of a breeze, having winnowed it, and then a bird or a rodent may come along and eat it, thereby storing it. Do you see what Jesus was dealing with? And why he didn't pay attention to the oral law? Like, this was far and away overboard. Verses 3 and 4, Craig, please.
3 and 4?
Yes.
Luke 6.
Yes, please.
And Jesus answered them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him, how they entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him."
Interesting, isn't it? But David wasn't condemned, nor were the men that were with him. Because the law of Moses never forbade a Levite from giving showbread to a non-Levite. But for a Pharisee, the Pharisaic law said that a Levite cannot give of the showbread. Now, in Matthew's account, Matthew 12, verse 5. Look what else Jesus speaks in reference to this context. So remember, the other gospel writers are filling in some details that the others don't necessarily deal with. So 12 verse 5, Carolyn, Matthew.
Or haven't you read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple desecrated the day, and yet are innocent?
So on the Sabbath, for the priests, it's the busiest day of the week for them. Every day they had daily offerings to bring, but on the Sabbath day they had double the offerings that they had to bring, and other rituals besides, special Sabbath rituals, but they were not guilty of having broken the Sabbath law. So more work was required of them, but they're blameless, Jesus said. And the Pharisees would not condemn them for that. So the temple really ends up coming into play here, where provides makes the allowance for priests to do what was necessary for the works of the temple. But Jesus says in verse 6, what?
"I tell you, something greater than the temple is here."
Yeah. So the temple allowed the priest to violate the Sabbath, but Jesus says one who is greater than the temple is here. Then look at verse 7, still in Matthew.
"If you had known what this means, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless."
Where did we hear that before? Jesus has already made this rebuke, appealing to Hosea 6 and verse 6. Do you remember? I desire mercy, not sacrifice. It was a few chapters back in Matthew 9 and verse 13. It was in reference to healing on the Sabbath. Good guess. Matthew. The calling of Matthew. And the Pharisees are upset because why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and with sinners? It's not the well that need a physician, but the sick. Go learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. So now Jesus refers to that again, still. Hosea 6 and verse 6. If you had known what this means. He says in Matthew 9, he says, go and learn what this means. You don't know the Scriptures. Remember, that's what he says to the Jews back in Jerusalem in John chapter 5. You don't know the Scriptures. You know the oral law, but you don't know the written law. You don't know the written Scriptures. Thus, this is what is written. Sure, you can recite it, but you don't practice it.
That would have been a slap to the, because you got a 30-year-old coming up to some of these guys are probably 60.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Teachers of the law.
Yeah.
And you got someone half their age come up, and you guys don't even know the Scripture.
So what's a work of mercy in this instance? Eating. You need to eat. It's an act of mercy. What about the man at the pool of Bethesda? Healing. It's an act of mercy. There's going to be one more. There's this trio of Sabbath healings or Sabbath controversies. But in verse 8, he says, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. In other words, Jesus could allow what they disallowed and would allow and disallow what they allowed. So what they said you could do, it was based on the oral law. What they said you couldn't do was based on the oral law. And Jesus is saying, listen, guys, you're talking to the Lord of the Sabbath. See, they had totally missed and misconstrued the purpose of the Sabbath. What does Jesus say the purpose of the Sabbath was in Mark's version? Mark 2:27.
The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath.
But the Pharisees said that Israel was made for the Sabbath. Big difference, isn't it? It was for rest. They turned it into this enslavement. Let's look at one more quickly. Back in Luke chapter 6. 6 to 11. Carolyn? Please.
Luke 6.
Yes, please.
On another Sabbath, he went into the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was shriveled. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. But Jesus knew what they were thinking and said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Get up and stand in front of everyone." So he got up and stood there. Then Jesus said to him, "I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it?" He looked around at them all and then said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He did so, and his hand was completely restored. But they were furious and began to discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus.
So this is entrapment, because they know that this man is there with the withered hand. Matthew 12 tells us that there's this man, and they asked Jesus, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? For what purpose? That they might accuse him. They're trying to trap him. It's entrapment. Luke tells us in verse 6, the man was there whose right hand was withered. It's an important distinction in a Middle Eastern context. For you and me, would it make much difference if your right hand or your left hand was withered? So if you're right-handed, but apart from that, culturally speaking, does the culture look more disfavorably upon one who has a withered right hand over a withered left hand in our culture? No. But in a Middle Eastern culture, what would they look upon a person who has a withered right hand over somebody who had a withered left hand? Any idea?
Left hand is used for cleaning themselves, where the right hand is used for work.
The right hand was used for work, eating, that sort of thing. Left hand, personal hygiene. And so, to have a withered right hand, what does that mean? Everything needs to be done with your defiled left hand. So it was a matter of not just his strength being gone, so it was a matter of strength and a matter of dignity.
Really, even economic, because of work.
Yeah, most people would not give him a job on account of that, because he would defile whatever it is that he put his hand to, or he would not be able to accomplish the work of others, the same kind of work.
I wonder if the man was originally a plant.
Yeah, it almost seems like they put him there intentionally on this day so that they could accuse him. Yeah. But Jesus knew their thoughts. So he gets him to stand up. And Mark tells us in chapter 3, verse 5, with anger. He looked at the Pharisees with anger because he's tired of this. And he doesn't turn to the man with anger, but to the Pharisees. He looks at them with it. Now, his anger, Jesus did not sin in his anger. Different than you and me, because more often than not, in our anger, we end up sinning. Doesn't mean that we can't be angry and not sin, but too often our anger can control us and lead us where we ought not to go. With Jesus, he was in perfect and total control. So he speaks to the man and he says, stretch out your hand. And that which was impossible for him in his current condition, Jesus gave the command and ability for him to do so. So he negated the Pharisaic authority. See, he speaks to them in Matthew. He says, what man among you who has a sheep, if it falls into a pit, what will you do? You will rescue it. You'll lay your hand on it and lift it. Although those works are not permitted on the Sabbath, but in order to save your sheep, you will do it because you make exception for it. So he says that it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. They're trying to prevent it. And look what we find out in verse 11. When this man was healed, the Pharisees were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. So Matthew 12:14 says they plotted how they might kill him. Mark 3 and verse 6 says they plotted with the Herodians how they could kill him. So the Herodians were the Jews that were sympathetic to they were against Rome, but they were sympathetic to having deliverance come from a king from the Herodian, the Herods. If they could deliver them, they would be good with that. But the Pharisees, the Herodians and the Pharisees, they were mortal enemies, basically. But basically for them, it was an enemy of my enemy is my friend. So they decided they would make friends with the Herodians in order to overthrow Jesus.
The depth of their blindness was astounding. Here they are, Jesus was healing on the Sabbath. They took exception to that. He would call himself the Son of God is his Father. But yet they can go away and then plot man's murder and not see anything wrong.
Like it's
astounding.
Yeah, it's the
But like Saul, who turned Paul, thought he was doing good by killing people.
So let me wrap this up with the idea of the Sabbath, because we'll be moving on from the Sabbath next week. The Sabbath was given to the Jews at Mount Sinai. In the fourth commandment, you shall honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy. In Exodus 31, verses 12 to 18, we won't look at it all, but he says this. So Exodus 31, verse 12, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak also to the children of Israel, saying, surely my Sabbaths you shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. You shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy to you. Verse 15, work shall be done for 6 days, but the seventh is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Verse 16, therefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. 17, it's a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. The Sabbath was given to the Jews as a sign of the covenant. But what was the purpose of the Sabbath? It was for their rest. Where was the Sabbath originated from? In Genesis chapter 2, the seventh day, God rested, ceased from his work. The first 6 days, every one of those days is described with this qualifier. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. There was evening and there was morning the third day. Same wording the fourth day. Same wording the fifth day. Evening and morning was the sixth day. But for the seventh day, there's no definer of evening and morning. Because evening and morning for those first 6 days gives an indication that there's parameters on this, that it begins in the evening, it ends when the next evening starts again. Evening and morning, that's the definer for the first day. Second day, third day, fourth, fifth, and 6 days. The seventh day, there's no definer or qualifier. So the Sabbath is an ongoing thing. Now, it's part of the 7-day cycle, so it's implied that yes, that's the case. But with no evening and no morning, it's indicating that the Sabbath of God has no end. And if the Sabbath of God finds its fulfillment in the Messiah, in Jesus. Because Jesus, remember he says, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. It doesn't mean he's just Lord, he's over the Sabbath, but he's the one who gives. Because Sabbath, what does Sabbath mean? The word literally means rest. For the Son of Man is Lord of rest. That's what Hebrews chapters 3 and 4 is all about. That Joshua was not able to bring them all into that Sabbath rest, but there remains a Sabbath rest for those who cease from their own labors and trust in God through Jesus Christ. And then that's chapter 4 of Hebrews, and it speaks about this high priest that we have, who's gone in ahead of us into the heavens. And because he is there without sin, having been tempted in every way like us, we are able to come to him with confidence before the throne of grace, so that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. So you see the connection of what Jesus is doing? He's not just there to rubble rouse. He's taken it right back to the beginning of Genesis, of the Sabbath. And God himself, he being God himself, spoke life, and created man to rest. Their disease and all of this other stuff is the result of sin. And Jesus is the remedy of sin. Not their own traditions and their own ideas, and not the inventions of their own minds of gods like Asclepius. The interrogation had continued, and they came against him, and Jesus set up these things on the Sabbaths to settle this idea that you don't exist for the Sabbath. The Sabbath exists for you. And Jesus continues with his ministry as we walk with Jesus through the Gospels.